The sun burned like a smelter's forge over Iron Hollow, Wyoming, 1885. Dust devils danced down the main street, swirling past the batwing doors of the rusty spur. Inside, Amos Kane pushed cold beans around his tin plate, a solitary island in the saloon's rough current. Then she appeared, barefoot, dress tattered as old lace. She stood haloed in the doorway's harsh light. Silence felt like a dropped hammer. She crossed the worn planks, eyes fixed on his plate. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" Her voice, a cracked whisper. Amos looked up. Into her eyes, wide and gray as storm clouds, he fell. What forgotten miracle did they hold? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The silence and the rusty spur stretched, taut as a bowstring. Amos Kane felt every eye in the dim, smoke-hazed room drill into him and the girl standing beside his table. The scent of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and yesterday's stew thick in the air. A fly buzzed, frantic, against a grimy window pane. The girl didn't flinch. Her gaze, that unsettling storm gray, remained locked on his face, waiting. Her bare feet were coated in the same ochre dust that powdered the street outside. Her thin shoulders hunched slightly, not in fear, Amos thought, but in the bone-deep weariness of constant hunger. Leftovers. The word rasped from Jed Cooper, the bartender, polishing the glass with a rag dirtier than the glass itself. A low chuckle rippled to the handful of patrons, grizzled miners nursing their pay, a couple of drifters playing desultory poker in the corner, a cattle hand with eyes like chips of flint. Ain't nothing left on that plate, except ghosts and regret. Girlie, move along. Amos ignored them. The girl's eyes held him. They weren't pleading, not exactly. There was a stark resilience in them, a flinty core beneath the exhaustion that resonated against the hard shell encasing his own heart. It was the eyes that did it, not the hunger, though that was plain enough in the sharp angles of her face, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, not the desperation clinging to her like the dust. It was the color, a gray, so like the Wyoming sky, just before a blizzard rolls down from the bighorns. A gray he hadn't seen in. He slammed the door shut on that memory. Don't. He looked down at his plate. Half a biscuit, hardened at the edges. A smear of beans gone cold and congealed. Scraps of salt pork, tough as leather. Hardly a feast. Hardly anything. Yet to her, he pushed the tin plate slowly across the rough-hewn table toward her. The scrape of metal on which sounded unnaturally loud. He didn't speak. Words felt like stones lodged in his throat. A collective intake of breath hissed through the saloon. Mockery curdled into something uglier, colder. "Soft touch, Kane," sneered the flint-eyed cowhand, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Amos's boot. "Feeding strays now? That ranch of yours turning into a damn charity house." Amos kept his gaze level on the girl. She hesitated only a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking to the plate, then back to his face, searching. Then, with a swiftness that belied her fragility, she snatched up the biscuit and began to eat small, frantic bites, her gaze darting around the room like a cornered animal's. The gray eyes held a flicker of something else now. Wariness, yes, but also a fierce, feral gratitude that cut through Amos more sharply than any insult. He reached into the pocket of his worn sheepskin coat, fingers brushing against the cold metal of his coat peacemaker, then finding the small leather pouch. He pulled out a single silver dollar, worn smooth by years of solitude. He placed it deliberately on the table beside the empty plate. It gleamed dully in the smoky light. "Get yourself some boots," he said, his voice rough, and used to forming so many words at once. It wasn't kindness, he told himself, just practicality. A barefoot girl wouldn't last a week on these plains before frostbite or rattlers took her. Practicality. That was all. He stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping harshly. He didn't look at the girl again. He didn't look at the smirking faces, the judgment radiating from the bar. He dropped a coin beside his empty whiskey glass for Jed and pushed through the batwing doors, stepping back into the furnace blast of the late afternoon sun. Iron Hollow sprawled before him, a collection of weathered wood and false fronts huddled against the immense, indifferent landscape. The Wind River Range loomed purple and snow-streaked in the distance, guardians of vast, empty country. Sagebrush stretched endlessly, silver-green under the relentless sun, humming with insects. The air smelled of dust, hot pine resin from the distant foothills, and the faint, acrid tang of the copper smelter just outside town. He walked stiffly toward the livery stable, where his buckskin gelding, Dusty, waited. The town felt claustrophobic suddenly, the saloon's hostility clinging to him like the smell of smoke. He needed the emptiness of Sagebrush Hollow, needed the silence broken only by wind and the lowing of his small herd, needed the familiar ache of solitude, uncomplicated by storm-gray eyes or the unsettling echo of forgotten pain. He saddled Dusty with practiced, economical movements. The leather creaked familiarly. As he swung up into the saddle, adjusting his hat against the glare, he saw her. She stood across the dusty street, partially hidden in the deep shade cast by the blacksmith's awning. Watching him, she held the silver dollar clutched tightly in one fist. She hadn't bought boots. Not yet. He nudged Dusty into a walk, turning onto the trail that led west out of town, towards the distant, sheltering hills where his ranch lay nestled. He didn't look back, not for the first mile, as the town dwindled behind him, shrinking into the shimmering heat haze. Not for the second mile, as the trail began to climb gently, winding through stands of gnarled pinyon pine and juniper. But the feeling persisted, a prickling awareness between his shoulder blades. Finally, cresting a rise that offered a long view back down the valley, he reined Dusty in and turned in the saddle. A small figure, a mere speck of faded brown against the ochre and green expanse, trudged along the trail, far behind but unmistakable, keeping her distance, but following stubbornly, doggedly, like a lost calf determined to find the herd. Amos exhaled, a long, slow breath that did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. He should ride back, tell her to turn around, point her towards what? Iron Hollow held nothing for her but scorn and danger. He knew that look in the townsfolk's eyes. Predatory. He'd seen it before. He thought of the empty cabin at Sagebrush Hollow, the silence that screamed, the untouched chair across the table, the cold hearth. Practicality warred with a deep, instinctive recoil from any intrusion into his carefully constructed isolation. Letting her follow felt like opening a door he'd sworn was nailed shut. Yet, turning her away felt like abandoning something fragile in a blizzard. He touched his heels to Dusty's flanks and moved on, neither hastening nor slowing his pace, a silent, grudging acceptance hanging heavy in the air between the man riding ahead and the girl walking behind. The sun dipped lower, painting the western sky in streaks of molten copper and bruised purple. Shadows lengthened, pooling in the arroyos and creeping across the high plains. The air cooled rapidly, carrying the scent of cooling earth and sage. Amos pushed open the creaking gate of the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of Sagebrush Hollow. The ranch wasn't grand. A single-story cabin of weathered logs, a squat bar and a small corral, and a lean-to for tools. A windmill spun lazily, its rhythmic groan a familiar counterpoint to the sighing wind. It stood in a shallow hollow, sheltered somewhat from the worst of the winds, but exposed enough to see anyone approaching for miles. Isolation wasn't just a state of mind here. It was geography. He unsaddled Dusty, rubbed him down, and turned him loose in the corral with fresh water. He pumped a bucket of cold, clear water from the well, the metallic clank echoing in the gathering dusk. He carried it toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He didn't look toward the gate, but he felt her presence now, a palpable thing hovering just beyond the boundary of his land. He set the bucket down on the porch, its worn boards groaning under his weight. He opened the heavy oak door, stepping into the cool, dim interior. The familiar smells of wood smoke, cured leather, and loneliness greeted him. He lit the kerosene lamp on the rough-hewn table, its yellow light pushing back the shadows, illuminating the simple room. Stone hearth, 2 chairs, a cupboard, a narrow cot against the far wall. He stood for a long moment, listening. The wind sighed around the eaves. A coyote yipped, far away. Then, softer, the faint crunch of gravel near the gate. He moved to the open doorway. She stood just inside the fence, barely visible in the twilight, a small, dark silhouette against the fading sky. She'd stopped waiting, watching the light spill from the open door. Her face was in shadow, but her posture spoke of utter exhaustion, a tremor running through her thin frame. The night air held a sharp bite, promising frost. Amos didn't speak. He simply stepped back from the doorway, leaving it open, an invitation, stark and silent. He walked to the hearth, knelt, and began to build a fire with dry kindling and split logs. The rasp of the flint striking steel was loud in the quiet. A spark caught, flared, then licked hungrily at the tinder. He fed it carefully, coaxing a small flame to life. Its warmth began to seep into the cabin's chill. He heard the softest tread on the porch boards. He didn't turn. He felt her pause in the doorway, a hesitation born of fear, or perhaps disbelief. The firelight cast dancing shadows. He added another log. Only then did he glance sideways. She stood just inside the threshold, one hand braced against the doorframe as if for support. Her storm-gray eyes, enormous in her gaunt face, reflected the flickering flames. They swept the room, the sparse furnishings, the cot, the fire, landing finally on him. The fierce resilience was still there, but overlaid now a profound, almost childlike vulnerability. She looked impossibly young, dwarfed by the vast emptiness of the West and the weight of whatever had brought her here. The silver dollar was still clutched in her hand. "Lila," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "My name's Lila." Amos gave a curt nod, still not trusting his voice. He gestured vaguely toward the empty chair near the hearth. She moved slowly, cautiously, lowering herself onto the very edge of the seat, poised for flight. She huddled towards the growing warmth, her thin arms wrapped tightly around herself. The silence stretched, filled only by the fire's murmur and the wind's low moan outside. He rose and moved to the cupboard. He pulled out a warm wool blanket, coarse but thick. He held it out to her. She stared at it for a moment, then reached out with trembling fingers, taking it as if it were spun glass. She pulled it tightly around her shoulders, burrowing into its scratchy embrace, her eyes closing briefly. A sigh, almost a whimper, escaped her as she adjusted the blanket. The neckline of her threadbare dress shifted slightly. Amos caught a glimpse of something around her neck, resting against her collarbone. Not a necklace. It was a small object, tied on a leather thong. Carved wood, dark and smooth. The firelight glinted on it for just an instant before it disappeared beneath the fabric again. He couldn't make out the shape clearly, but it looked avian, like a tiny bird, wings folded, a trinket, out of place, too finely made for the ragged girl who wore it. A relic of a different life? A talisman? He turned back to the fire, the question unasked. The warmth was spreading now, pushing the deep chill from the corners of the room, but a different kind of cold settled in Amos's bones. This was a complication, a dangerous one. He thought of the flint-eyed cowhand in the saloon, the predatory gleam. Iron Hollow wasn't kind to strays. Who was she running from? Why? The carved bird hinted at secrets, and secrets in this territory often bled. Outside, the night deepened. The stars emerged, cold and brilliant, strewn like diamond dust across black velvet. Miles away, back down the trail towards Iron Hollow, a figure stood motionless on a high ridge, silhouetted against the starlit sky. He hadn't followed the girl openly through town, knowing eyes watched. He'd ridden wide, circling, patient as a hunting wolf. Now, he lowered the brass spyglass from his eye. The distant pinpoint of light, a single lamp glowing in the vast darkness of Sagebrush Hollow, marked his destination. A grim satisfaction tightened his lips. Found you. His gloved hand rested on the worn walnut grip of the revolver at his hip. He'd wait for dawn. Let the rancher get comfortable. Let the girl feel safe. Then he'd collect what was owed. The wind, colder now, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks, hissed around him like a whispered promise of violence. He turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving only the indifferent stars to witness his departure. Inside the cabin, Amos Kane felt a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He glanced at the girl, Lila, asleep now in the chair, the blanket pulled high, the faint outline of the small wooden bird just visible beneath the worn fabric at her throat. The fire crackled, a fragile defiance against the immense, watching dark. The silence now felt charged, waiting. The chill Amos felt wasn't the night air seeping through the chinks in the cabin logs. It was a cold finger tracing his spine, a residue of the unseen watcher on the ridge, a phantom echo of the spyglass lens catching the starlight. He banked the fire carefully, the flames now low, pulsing hard in the room, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to flinch at the edges. Lila slept fitfully in the chair, curled tight as a bird beneath the coarse wool blanket, her breath hitching occasionally. The small, carved bird rested against her collarbone, a dark shape beneath the worn fabric, a question mark etched in wood. Dawn came hard and gray over Sagebrush Hollow. Frost glittered on the split-rail fences like a million broken vows, and the wind, sharper now, moaned down from the Wind River peaks like a grieving spirit. Amos was already moving, the ingrained rhythm of survival overriding the restless night. He pumped water, icy against his callous hands, filled a battered tin coffee pot, and set it on the stove. The mundane sounds, the clank of the pump handle, the scrape of the pot, felt loud in the fragile quiet. He sensed her wakefulness before he saw her eyes open, a slight stiffening beneath the blanket, then the slow blink of those storm-gray irises, wide and wary in the dim light, filtering through the single window. She watched him, silent, taking in the small cabin, the man moving with economical grace, the reality of her precarious sanctuary. "Coffee's brewing," Amos said, his voice rough with disuse. He didn't look at her directly, busying himself with slicing yesterday's cornbread, an offering, a test. She sat up slowly, the blanket pulling around her waist. She touched the wooden bird at her throat almost unconsciously, a gesture grounding. "Thank you," she whispered, the words fragile as spun glass. The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the warming stove and the wind's lament outside. Amos placed a piece of cornbread and a tin mug of black coffee on the table near her chair. He took his own mug and stood by the window, looking out across the frost-rimed hollow towards the ridge where the watcher had stood. The vast emptiness offered no comfort today. It felt like a stage waiting. "Name's Amos," he finally offered, still gazing out. "Amos Kane." "Lila," she repeated softly, as if confirming it to herself. She picked up the cornbread, nibbling at the edge with surprising delicacy, despite her hunger. Her eyes darted around the room again, lingering on a simple wooden shelf near the hearth. It held few things: a worn Bible, a tin of gun grease, a small, framed daguerreotype turned face down. Amos tensed, a familiar ache tightening his chest. He hadn't touched that frame in years. "Need water brought in," he stated abruptly, turning from a window. Practicality. A task. Something to fill the silence, to push back the ghosts crowding the edges of the room. "Pumps out back. Buckets by the door." She nodded, setting down the cornbread. She stood, unfolding herself with a stiffness that spoke of miles walked on bare, frozen ground. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her thin shoulders like armor and picked up the empty wooden bucket. Her bare feet made no sound on the rough plank floor as she slipped out the door into the biting morning. Amos watched her through the window. She approached the pump cautiously, her breath pluming in the cold air. She struggled slightly with the stiff handle, her thin arms straining, but she persisted. Water gushed, splashing into the bucket. There was a determined set to her jaw, a resilience that mirrored the stubborn sagebrush clinging to life on the windswept plains. Not helpless, then, just lost. He turned away, his gaze falling inevitably on the face-down daguerreotype. He hadn't looked at Sarah and Little Beth in so long. The pain was a physical thing, a heavy stone lodged beneath his ribs. But Lila's eyes, that carved bird, they stirred something, an echo he couldn't silence. He picked up the frame slowly, the wood smooth under his fingers from years of avoidance. He hesitated, then flipped it over. Sarah's gentle smile, Beth's bright, curious eyes, frozen in time. Beth had been 4, full of questions, laughter like bells. Amos's thumb traced the edge of the frame, a familiar grief washing over him, cold and deep. Then his gaze snagged on something Beth held in the picture. Clutched in her small hand was a wooden toy, not a bird, but a horse, carved with the same kind of care, the same smooth, dark wood. His brother Elias had made it. Elias, who'd gone north years ago, chasing gold rumors. Elias, who had hands that could coax shapes from wood as easily as Amos could coax life from the stubborn earth. "Did you carve that bird, Eli?" The question formed unbidden, a thread connecting this ragged girl to a past Amos had buried. Lila returned, setting the heavy bucket of water down carefully. Her eyes immediately went to the picture in his hands. She froze, her gaze fixed on the image of the little girl, then flickered to the carved horse. A flicker of something, recognition, sadness, crossed her face before she quickly looked down, busying herself with wiping water splashes from the bucket's rim. Amos set the frame back down, face up this time, a silent acknowledgement. "The heifers," he said, his voice gruffer than intended, "need check-in in the west pasture. Fence line there's been weak." He grabbed his worn sheepskin coat and hat. "You stay put, keep the fire banked." Protection, isolation, the conflicting impulses warred within him. Her head snapped up. "I can help." Not a plea, a statement. "I know fences. Grew up." She trailed off, biting her lip, her hand going again to the bird at her throat. "I can help," she repeated, meeting his gaze with that unnerving steadiness. He studied her. The fierce resolve in her gray eyes war with a tremor in her thin frame. Practicality won again. An extra pair of eyes, even inexperienced ones, could spot a break he might miss. "Boots first," he said, gesturing toward the pair of Sarah's old work boots tucked away in a corner, sturdy but smaller than his own. "See if they fit. Coat's on the peg." A flicker of surprise, then gratitude warmed her eyes. She pulled on the boots, a little large but serviceable with thick socks Amos wordlessly handed her. Sarah's old wool coat swallowed her, but she wrapped it tightly, transforming from a waif into a small, determined figure ready for work. The walk to the west pasture was silent, the crunch of frost underfoot loud in the vast stillness. The sun climbed, pale and weak, doing little to warm the air. Sagebrush hollow unfolded around them, rolling silver-green plains giving way to rocky outcrops and pine-studded foothills in the distance. Amos pointed out landmarks. The dry creek bed that flooded in spring, the stand of aspens where deer sometimes sheltered, the high ridge line marking the boundary of his claim. Lila listened intently, her eyes scanning the horizon with a vigilance that spoke of ingrained caution. She moved with a natural awareness of the land, stepping lightly, avoiding noisy gravel patches. They reached the fence line. Amos handed her a pair of worn leatherwork gloves. "Look for wire down. Posts lean in. Gaps a calf could squeeze through." He set to work checking the tautness of the strands, the solidity of the cedar posts. Lila moved parallel to him, surprisingly methodical, her small hands testing wires, pushing against posts. She paused at one section, crouching down. "Here," she called softly. Amos walked over. The bottom wire was loose, sagging dangerously. Worse, the post it was stapled to was deeply gouged near the base, not weathered, but freshly splintered, as if struck hard with a heavy tool. "Sabotage," The word landed like a blow. Not an accident, a warning, or a preparation. Amos's jaw tightened. He scanned the surrounding ridges, the open plain. Nothing moved but a lone hawk circling high overhead. The vastness felt suddenly menacing. He pulled a rawhide lasso from his saddlebag, along with wire cutters and a spare staple. "Hold this," he instructed Lila, handing her the end of the lasso. He looped it around the wobbly post, tied it off the dusty saddle horn, and had the gelding pull the post mostly upright again. He quickly restapled the wire, the sharp clink of the hammer echoing in the stillness. It was a temporary fix. The message was clear. Someone knew where she was, and they weren't waiting for a social call. Lila watched him work, her face pale. She hadn't missed the meaning of the damaged post. Her hand was clenched around the carved bird again, knuckles white. "He's here," she whispered. Not a question. "Seems so," Amos replied tersely. Coiling the lasso, he scanned the horizon again, his hand resting near the worn walnut grip of his coat. "Who is he, Lila? Who's looking for you?" She flinched, wrapping her arms around herself inside the oversized coat. She looked impossibly young, the fierce resilience momentarily drowned by fear. "Silas," she breathed. The name sounded like a curse. Silas Rourke. She wouldn't meet his eyes. He thinks I took something. That wasn't mine to take." Her gaze flickered down to the bird at her throat. Just a memory. Tears welled in her storm-gray eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "My pa, he gave it to me, before—" She choked off, shaking her head violently. "Rourke worked for him. Thinks I know more." The fragments were painful, sharp-edged. A father gone, a trusted man turned hunter, a girl fleeing with a wooden bird in secret she couldn't or wouldn't share. Amos absorbed this. A personal vendetta, then not law. That complicated things. Law could sometimes be reasoned with, bought off, avoided. Men like Rourke, fueled by greed or perceived betrayal, were less predictable, more dangerous. The carved bird, a simple trinket, suddenly felt heavy with implication. What memory did it hold? What knowledge did Rourke believe it symbolized? They finished checking the fence line in tense silence. Amos's senses stretched taut, scanning every shadow, every movement in the distant sage. He found no other sabotage, but the unease clung like persistent cold. On the walk back, they detoured to the creek bed, mostly dry now, just a trickle over smooth stones. Amos knelt to fill his canteen. Lila crouched nearby, washing the dust from her hands and face. As she leaned forward, the carved bird slipped free from the neckline of her dress, dangling fully into view on its leather thong in the weak sunlight. Amos froze. The detail he hadn't seen clearly by firelight was now stark. It wasn't just any bird. It was a meadow lark, wings swept back as if in mid-flight, exquisitely carved, the feathers subtly textured, the beak slightly open as if singing. And on the base, tiny but distinct, were carved initials, Ike Elias Kane, his brother. Confirmation slammed into Amos, stealing his breath. Elias had carved this. But for Lila's pa, how? When the threads of the past tangled dangerously with the present peril. He stood abruptly, the full canteen forgotten in his hand. "That bird," he said, his voice tight. "The initials, Ike. That's my brother, Elias Kane." Lila's head jerked up, water dripping from her chin. Her eyes widened, pure shock erasing the fear for a moment. "Your brother?" She clutched the bird protectively. "But," Pa said, "he got it from a wanderer, years back, before—" She trailed off, confusion warring with a dawning, terrifying hope. Is Elias gone? Amos cut in harshly, the old bitterness rising. Went north, years ago, never came back. The implications swirled. Had Elias known Lila's father? Had he passed through wherever she came from? Was that why Rourke thought she knew something valuable? Something connected to Elias's disappearance? The wooden bird was no longer just a trinket. It was a key, and Silas Rourke was determined to turn it. The walk back to cabin was heavy with unspoken questions and thickening dread. Amos felt exposed, the ranch no longer a fortress, but trapped silhouetted against the open sky. He needed information. He needed to know what Rourke looked like, how many men he might have. Iron Hollow, with its prying eyes and loose tongues, was the only place to start, though he loathed the thought of leaving Lila alone, even for a few hours. Later that afternoon, Amos rode Dusty back towards Iron Hollow, leaving Lila with strict instructions to bar the door and stay away from the windows. The wind had picked up again, carrying the bite of snow and whipping dust devils across the trail. The town felt different now, not just claustrophobic, but charged with unseen danger. He avoided the rusty spur, heading instead for Jed Cooper's Mercantile, a dim, cluttered space smelling of dry goods and coal oil. Jed looked up from behind the counter, his expression guarded as Amos entered. "Kane, heard you took on a stray." His tone was neutral, but his eyes held a flicker of something, curiosity, maybe warning. Amos leaned on the counter, picking up a tin of peaches he didn't need. Girl needed shelter. Harsh night. He kept his voice casual. "See any strangers about?" "Not the usual drifters." "Someone harder." Jed polished a glass, his movement slow. "Strangers come and go." He met Amos's gaze. "Fella rode in yesterday evening. Didn't stop at the spur, didn't buy nothing. Just asked questions down a delivery. About the trail west, about ranches out that way." Jed paused, his voice dropping. "Big fella. Rides a mean-looking dun. Wears his iron low and tied down. Got eyes like a snake assessing a mouse." He set the glass down with a soft click. Asked particular about Sagebrush Hollow. Asked if a young woman might have passed through. Barefoot. Jed's gaze was steady, unreadable. Told him I hadn't seen no barefoot girls. Didn't seem to believe in type. Silas Rourke. Amos felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. He was here. He knew exactly where Lila was. "Much obliged, Jed," Amos said, dropping coins on the counter for peaches. "Watch yourself, Kane," Jed murmured as Amos turned to leave. "That one carries a darkness with him." Amos rode back toward Sagebrush Hollow as dusk settled like a heavy curse, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly yellows. The wind hissed through the sage, carrying Jed's warning and the image of the snake-eyed man on the dun horse. He pushed Dusty harder, the need to get back a physical pressure in his chest. The ranch came into view, a darker silhouette against the fading light. No welcoming lamp glowed in the window. His orders had been followed. Good girl. He approached cautiously, scanning the outbuildings, the corral, the ridge lines. Nothing seemed amiss. He dismounted near the barn, unsaddling Dusty quickly in the deepening gloom. The silence felt thick, watchful. As he led Dusty into his stall, his boot kicked something small and metallic, lying in the straw near the door. He bent down, picking it up, a spent brass rifle cartridge. .44-40. Fresh, not one of his. His blood ran cold. Someone had been here. Close, watching the cabin, waiting. He straightened up, every sense screaming. He scanned the barn's shadowed interior, the rafters lost in darkness. Dust motes danced in the last sliver of light from the open door. Then he saw it. Nailed to the central support beam, stark against the weatherwood, was a single sheet of paper. He stepped closer, the cartridge clenched tight in his fist. Scrawled in a harsh, angular hand were the words, "Sunrise, bring the girl and the bird, or burn." Outside in the vast, listening dark, a coyote howled, a long, mournful sound that seemed to hang in the freezing air. Inside the barn, Amos Kane stood frozen, the crude message burning into his vision, the spent cartridge cold and heavy in his hand. The fragile piece of Sagebrush Hollow was shattered. The hunter had declared his terms. Dawn was coming, and with it, fire. The brass cartridge was cold as death in Amos's palm, the scrawled threat on the barn beam burning like a brand in his mind. Sunrise. Bring the girl and the bird, or burn. The coyote's mournful howl seemed to coil around the words, a dirge of fragile peace he'd foolishly allowed himself to imagine. Dust motes danced in the fading light slanting to the barn door, suddenly seeming like sparks waiting to ignite. He moved. Instinct, honed by years of solitude and loss, overrode the icy dread pooling in his gut. He ripped the paper down, crumpling it into his coat pocket with the spent shell. Back inside the cabin, the air felt thick, charged. Lila stood frozen by the cold hearth, Sarah's oversized coat dwarfing her, her storm-gray eyes wide pools of terror reflecting the dimness. She'd seen his face. "He was here," she breathed, not a question. Her hand was a white-knuckled fist around the carved bird beneath her dress. "In the barn." Left the calendar card. Amos's voice was gravel. He didn't elaborate. The message was clear enough. He crossed the heavy oak door, sliding the thick timber bar into place with a solid thunk. The sound echoed in the small space, a declaration of defiance. He moved to the single window, thick-paned and small, peering out into the deepening twilight. The vast emptiness of Sagebrush Hollow now felt like a tightening noose. "Sunrise," he stated flatly. He turned back the room. Practicality was the only weapon he had against a rising tide of fear. Fear for this girl, fear the fire Rourke promised, fear the ghost this whole mess was stirring. We fought up, bar the shutters, move the table. He gestured towards a sturdy table. "Against the door, once we're done." Lila didn't hesitate. The terror in her eyes was momentarily eclipsed by a fierce determination to survive. She helped him drag the table, its legs scraping harshly on the plank floor, positioning it angled against the barred door. Amos fetched his tools, a hammer, nails salvaged from a tin, a short length of scrap lumber. He worked quickly, silently, reinforcing the window shutters from the inside, hammer blows ringing sharp and urgent in confined space. Each strike felt like a heartbeat counting down to dawn. Lila watched, then disappeared into the shadowed corner near the cot. She returned carrying Amos's Henry rifle, the brass receiver catching the faint light. She handled it with surprising, grave respect, holding it out to him. "Pa taught me," she said quietly, answering his unspoken surprise. "Said every soul out here needs to know the weight of iron." The admission was a sliver of her past, offered in the face of annihilation. Amos took the rifle, the familiar walnut stock cool against a palm. He checked the load, the metallic clink-clink of cartridges a grim counterpoint to the hammering. He laid it on the table, then retrieved his Colt Peacemaker from its worn holster, placing it beside the rifle. The twin instruments of death looked stark and final on the scarred wood. He caught Lila staring at the daguerreotype on the shelf, Sarah and Beth smiling eternally, Beth clutching Elias's carved horse. Her fingers brushed the bird at her own throat. "Elias," she whispered, the name strange on her tongue. "Your brother?" "Pa," said the wanderer who gave him the bird. He was troubled, haunted, Pa thought, like something chased him even then. Amos froze, a nail half driven into the shutter frame. Haunted, the word resonated with the image of Elias he carried. Not the laughing brother of their youth, but the shadowed man who'd left for the gold fields years ago, his letters growing sparse, then ceasing altogether. The last one, brittle and yellowed, was tucked inside the Bible on the shelf. Amos remembered the shaky script, the mention of a place called Silver Peak, a vague warning about shadows gathering. He dismissed it as gold fever ramblings. Now, it felt like a cold finger tracing his spine. Had something chased Elias? Had it caught him? And was Silas Rourke part of that same shadow? He finished nailing the shutter, the final blow echoing too loudly. The cabin felt like a tomb now, dark and airless. He lit the kerosene lantern, turning the wick low, casting long, leaping shadows that seemed to mock their feeble preparations. He pumped water into every container he could find, buckets, the wash basin, the coffee pot, lining them up near the hearth. If Rourke meant fire, they'd need every drop. Lila sank onto the edge of a chair, the rifle resting across her knees. She looked impossibly small, swallowed by Sarah's coat, yet her grip on the weapon was firm. She pulled the carved bird fully out, letting it rest on the worn wool covering her chest. The firelight caught the delicate sweep of the meadowlark's wings, the tiny, precise initials, Ike. Her thumb traced the smooth wood almost reverently. Pa said, he said it was more than pretty, said the man who carved it. He'd hidden a truth inside it, a map, maybe, or a message. But Pa, he couldn't find how to open it. She looked up at Amos, her eyes huge. He never told Rourke that part, just that it was valuable. That's why Rourke thinks I know, thinks I have the secret. Amos stared at the bird. A hidden truth? Inside Elias's carving? It seemed fantastical, yet the desperate pursuit, the threat of fire, it lent the claim a terrible weight. He stepped closer, reaching out slowly. Lila didn't flinch. He took the bird, its wood warm from her skin. He turned it over in his calloused hands, feeling the seamless join where wings met body, the smooth curve of the base. No seams, no catches, just exquisite, solid craftsmanship, his brother's handiwork. But a hidden compartment? He pressed, probed, twisted gently. Nothing. It felt utterly solid. Maybe Pa was wrong. Lila whispered, disappointment warring with fear. Maybe it's just a bird. Amos wasn't so sure. Elias had always been clever, secretive even as a boy. If he'd hidden something, Amos's gaze drifted back to the Bible on the shelf. The letter, Silver Peak, a place named Elias mentioned with unease. Was that the truth hidden? A location? He tucked the bird carefully back into Lila's hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. Her skin was ice cold. Keep it safe, he murmured. Whatever it is, Rourke wants it bad. He moved the shuttered window, peering through a narrow crack. Night had fully claimed the hollow. Stars burned like cold, silent accusations in the black velvet sky. The wind had died, leaving an eerie stillness that pressed against the cabin walls. Too still, the coyotes had fallen silent. Amos strained his ears, listening for the crunch of a boot, the creak of saddle leather. Nothing, just the frantic hammering of his own heart. Was Rourke out there now, a dark shape in the sage, waiting for first gray light of dawn? Or was he the kind to strike in the deceptive quiet of deepest night? Suddenly, Lila stiffened. She tilted her head, her body taut as a bowstring. Smoke, she breathed. Amos inhaled deeply. At first, nothing. Then a faint, acrid tang pricked his nostrils. Not wood smoke. Harsher. Dry grass. Sagebrush. Fire. He wrenched open the shutter crack wider, pressing his face against the cold glass. To the east, beyond the corral, towards a dry creek bed they'd visited that afternoon, an orange glow pulsed against the horizon. Not the concentrated flare of a building ablaze, but a low, spreading smear of light, growing steadily brighter, feeding on the tender dry winter grass and brush. Even as he watched, a tendril of flame leapt higher, silhouetted against the night. Rourke hadn't waited for sunrise. He was burning his way towards them, herding them with walls of flame. The creek! Amos snapped, his mind racing. The fire was downwind, driven by the prevailing night breeze from the east. The dry creek bed, with its sparse vegetation and wide gravel banks, was their only chance. Grab the canteen, the rifle. He snatched up his coat, shoving it into his belt. He grabbed the nearest bucket of water, dousing the lantern instantly, plunging them into near total darkness save for the hellish glow growing outside. He threw open the water barrel, soaking 2 thick horse blankets, tossing one to Lila. Wrap this, cover your head. Smoke was thickening the air inside the cabin now, stinging their eyes and throats. The crackle of the advancing fire was a growing roar, like a vengeful spirit unleashed. Heat radiated through the walls. Amos heaved the table aside, and lifted the heavy timber bar from the door. "Stay low. Run for the creek. Don't stop." He yanked the door open. A wall of heat and smoke hit them like a physical blow. Embers rained down like malevolent fireflies. The eastern sky was a churning cauldron of orange and black, the fire racing hungrily through the sage, consuming everything in its path, driven by the wind straight toward the cabin and barn. The air shimmered with intense heat. "Go!" Amos roared. Shoving Lila headed him out the door, the soap blanket over his own head and shoulders. They stumbled down the porch steps into an inferno's antechamber. The roar was deafening. Flames licked at the split-rail fence nearby, devouring the dry wood. The corral gate glowed red-hot. Dusty whinnied in terror from the barn. Lila ran, bent double, clutching the soap blanket, coughing violently. Amos followed, his eyes slitted against the smoke and heat, scanning the chaotic, flame-lit landscape. The path to the creek bed was a gauntlet of heat and falling embers. They veered away from the direct line of the fire's advance, angling southwest toward the relative safety of the gravel wash. Halfway there, a dark shape detached itself from the swirling smoke and flamed near the burning barn. Not Rourke. A man Amos didn't recognize, lean and hard-faced, a bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth, a rifle held ready. One of Rourke's men. He raised his weapon, aiming not at Amos, but at Lila's fleeing form. Amos didn't think. He dropped his blanket, drew the Colt in one fluid motion, and fired. The report was swallowed by the fire's roar. The man jerked back, his shot going wide, kicking up dirt near Lila's feet. He stumbled, clutching his arm, then vanished back into the smoke and flame. "Keep running," Amos yelled, grabbing his blanket, his lungs burning. He fired 2 more shots into the smoke where the man had disappeared, a covering volley. They reached the lip of the dry creek bed and half slid. Half fell down the steep gravel bank into the shallow trench. The air was marginally clearer here, though thick with smoke and the oppressive heat. The fire roared past on the banks above them, a river of flame consuming the ranch Amos had built with Sarah, consuming the fragile refuge he'd offered Lila. The cabin roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The barn groaned as its timbers gave way. Dusty's terrified scream was cut off abruptly. Lila huddled against the gravel bank, coughing, her face streaked with soot and tears, the rifle still clutched in her hands. Amos knelt beside her, scanning the upper bank through stinging eyes. The firelight danced on the rim, casting monstrous, leaping shadows. Shapes moved up there, 2, maybe 3 figures silhouetted against the inferno, watching, waiting for them to be flushed into the open like quail. He looked down at Lila, her storm-gray eyes wide with terror and loss. He saw the carved bird, miraculously still around her neck, glinting dully in the hellish light. Elias's bird, the hidden truth, Silver Peak. It was all they had left. "They're up there," Lila choked out, pointing a trembling finger toward the western rim of the creek bed, away from the main fire. Amos followed her gaze. 2 more figures stood outlined against the lesser glow of the burning ranch, blocking their escape route down the creek. Trapped, the fire raged to the east and north, Rourke's men to the west. The creek bed offered scant cover and dwindled into a narrow gulch ahead, a potential dead end. Amos pulled Lila deeper into the scant shadow of the undercut bank. He checked the Colt. 3 rounds left. The Henry rifle Lila held had maybe 7, against at least 4 men, possibly more hidden in the smoke. The roar of the fire was a constant, suffocating presence. Embers sifted down on them like hot, mournful snow. One of the figures on the western rim raised his arm, not with a weapon. He held something small and dark. He drew back his arm and threw. The object arced through the smoke-hazed air, landing with a soft thud in the gravel, a few yards from where Amos and Lila crouched. It wasn't a rock. It was a leather satchel, old, scarred, the kind a prospector might carry, and stamped faintly on the flap, barely visible in the flickering light, were the initials, E.K. The leather satchel lay in the gravel like a coiled serpent, its scarred surface illuminated by the hellish glow of the burning ranch. The initials EK seemed to pulse in the flickering light. Embers sifted down like hot, accusing snow, hissing where they landed on the damp horse blanket Amos had draped over Lila. The fire roared beyond the creek bank, a vengeful hymn consuming the remnants of Sagebrush Hollow, the cabin's skeletal timbers, the barn's collapsed ruin, the life Amos had carved from the wilderness. Dusty was gone. The past was ash. Only the choking present remained. The suffocating smoke, the oppressive heat, the unseen menace of Rourke's men watching from the rims above, and this worn leather enigma hurled into their refuge. Amos didn't hesitate. Survival was a series of brutal, immediate choices. He lunged, snatching the satchel, the leather warm and stiff beneath his fingers. He scrambled back beside Lila under the scant overhang of the creek bank. Her storm-gray eyes, wide with terror and rimmed red from smoke, flickered between the satchel and the dancing shadows above where the silhouetted figures waited. She clutched the carved bird at her throat, her knuckles white on the Henry rifle's stock. "Elias," she breathed, the name a fragile question lost in the fire's roar. Amos fumbled with the stiff brass buckle. His fingers, callous and strong from ranch work, felt clumsy with urgency and dread. The clasp yielded with a reluctant snap. He plunged his hand inside, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His fingers closed around two objects, a small brass case compass and a sheaf of papers, brittle and yellowed, tied with frayed rawhide cord. He pulled them out. The compass felt cold and heavy, a stark contrast to the inferno around them. Its glass face was cracked, but the needle trembled, pointing stubbornly north-northwest. He set it aside, his focus on the papers. Carefully, he untied the cord. The top sheet was a letter. The ink faded, but the handwriting achingly familiar. Elias's bold, looping script, though shakier than Amos remembered, the lines uneven as if written under duress. Silver Peak, October 12, 1879. Amos, if this finds you, reckon I won't be coming home. Got myself tangled in something deep and dark. Found color, brother, more than a panner's dream. A vein like liquid sunlight in Shadow Canyon. Partnered with a good man, Jedediah Vance. Honest. Had a young daughter, Lila, bright as a new penny. We swore secrecy. Knew this kind of fortune draws wolves. But the wolf was already among us. Silas Rourke. Hired him for muscle. Seemed solid. Till the gold fever took him. Turned viper quick. Suspects the scale of it. Jedediah, he confided in me. Feared for Lila. Feared Rourke meant to cut us out permanent-like. We hid the assay reports. The true map. Split him. Jedediah took the details. I made a key. Something only family or someone Jedediah trusted with his life might understand. A meadowlark. Remember Pa's old music box? The bird that turned with a song? Rourke's close in. Can feel it. If he gets to Jedediah. Protect the girl, Amos. If she finds you, if she has the bird, it's more than a trinket. Twist the head against the grain. When the sun sits high, it holds the bearing. The bearing and the map lead to the truth, to Shadow Canyon, to enough to live free. Forgive me for vanishing. Wanted that gold to be our family's fresh start. Now it's just a curse. If Lila comes, trust her eyes. They're Jedediah's. Storm Gray, Hauna Man, your brother, Elias. The words blurred. Amos's breath hitched, a raw sound swallowed by the fire's growl. Jedediah Vance. Lila, storm gray eyes. The pieces slammed together with brutal force. The girl trembling beside him wasn't just a runaway. She was the daughter of his brother's partner. Elias hadn't just vanished chasing fool's gold. He'd found a fortune and been hunted for it. Hunted by the same man who now sought to burn them alive. And Elias had entrusted the key to the secret to a carved bird, a key only Amos, remembering their father's long-lost music box, might unlock. Twist the head against the grain when the sun sits high. It held the bearing, the final piece to the map Elias mentioned. He looked up, meeting Lila's terrified gaze. In the flickering orange light, her eyes were indeed Jedediah Vance's, storm gray, hauntingly familiar now he knew to look. "Your pa," Amos rasped, his voice thick with smoke and revelation. "Jedediah Vance, partner with Elias at Silver Peak." Lila's face crumpled. A sob escaped, raw and painful. "Pa," he said, Uncle Silas turned bad. "Wanted the shiny rock papers. Pa hid them. Send me away with the bird. Said find a man who carved it. Find family." Tears carved tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "Rourke, he found Pa before I got far. I heard the shot." She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. "The bird, Pa just said keep it safe. That it sang the truth. I didn't know how." Amos's hand instinctively covered hers where it gripped the carved meadowlark. The grief for his brother, the horror of Jedediah Vance's murder, the sheer weight of Rourke's greed, it threatened to crush him. But beneath it, a fierce protectiveness surged, hotter than the surrounding flames. This girl, Lila Vance, was all that remained of Elias's last, desperate partnership. She was family, bound by blood spilled and secrets buried. A sharp crack split the air. A bullet ricocheted off a rock inches from Amos's head, spraying stinging fragments. One of the silhouettes on the western rim lowered a smoking rifle. "Time's wasting, Kane," a rough voice bellowed over fire's din. "Rourke says toss out the bird and the girl, or the next one finds bone." They were out of time, out of refuge. The fire was chewing its way south, the creek bed narrowing ahead into a rocky gulch. The satchel's contents were a lifeline, but they needed the bearing locked inside the bird, and the sun was hours from being high enough to attempt Elias's mechanism. They had to move. Now, Amos shoved a letter and compass into the satchel, slinging it over his shoulder. He grabbed the Henry rifle from Lila's numb hands. "Stay behind me, low and fast. We run for the gulch." He pointed downstream where the creek bed vanished between high, boulder-strewn walls. It was a trap, potentially, but staying was death. He fired 2 quick shots toward the western rim, not aiming to hit, but to force heads down. "Go!" he roared. They ran, bent double, scrambling over loose gravel and slick stones, the soaked blankets dragging like anchors. Amos led, his Colt now drawn in his other hand. Shots rang out from above, bullets kicking up dirt and winding off rocks. Lila stumbled, cried out, but pushed on, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Amos returned fire when he glimpsed a target, the Colt bucking in his hand. A man on the rim yelped and dropped from view. The gulch mouth loomed, a dark maw framed by towering fire-lit cliffs. Just as they reached it, a figure dropped down from the eastern bank directly ahead, landing heavily in the creek bed. It was a lean-faced man Amos had winged earlier, his arm bandaged crudely, his eyes filled with venom, and a Colt aimed steadily. "End of the line, Kane," he snarled, spitting blood. "Rourke wants his." Amos didn't let him finish. He dropped to one knee, bringing the Henry rifle up in a single, fluid motion. The rifle cracked, the sound sharp and final in confined space of the gulch entrance. The man jerked backwards, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. He crumpled into the gravel, his gun clattering away. No time for remorse. Amos grabbed Lila's arm, hauling her past the fallen man into the relative darkness of the gulch. The roar of the fire diminished slightly, replaced by an eerie echo of their own frantic footsteps and the drip of moisture from the rocky walls. The air was cooler, thick with the smell of damp stone and ancient dust. High above, a sliver of star-strewn sky was visible between the canyon walls. They ran deeper, the gulch twisting and turning, the footing treacherous. Amos scanned the shadows, expecting another ambush at every bend. How many men did Rourke have? Where was the snake-eyed hunter himself? Finally, Winded and trembling, they stumbled into a slightly wider section where a small spring seeped from the rock face, creating a shallow pool. They collapsed beside it, gulping in the clearer air, listening. No immediate sound of pursuit. The fire's glow was a faint, angry blush reflected high on the canyon walls behind them. In the dim, reflected light, Amos pulled out the satchel again. He unfolded the other papers Elias had hidden. Maps, crude, hand-drawn charts of mountainous terrain, marked with cryptic symbols and notations: Devil's Slide, Echo Falls, Shadow Canyon. One map showed Silver Peak and the surrounding ranges. Another, smaller and more detailed, depicted a labyrinthine canyon system with a single bold X deep within it, labeled the Sun's Vein. But no compass rose, no indication of how to orient it. That, Elias had said, was locked in the bird, waiting for the high sun. Lila crouched beside the pool, splashing water on her face. She looked up, her eyes catching the faint light. "Uncle Elias, he made the bird sing the truth," she whispered, touching the wooden meadowlark. "Pa, he loved that old music box story. Said the bird only sang when you turn it right." Amos nodded, the memory Elias had invoked surfacing to the foggy years. Their father's prized music box, brought from the old country, a delicate enamel bird that would rotate and seem to sing when the mechanism was wound. Elias, fascinated, had spent hours taking it apart and putting it back together as a boy. Twist the head against the grain. It wasn't just a turn, it was a specific, counterintuitive action, mimicking the winding of that old music box. He held out his hand. "Lila," the bird, "let me try." She hesitated for only a second, then lifted the leather thong over her head. She placed a small, smooth carving into his palm. The firelight from the canyon mouth caught the delicate wings. The tiny initials E.K. Amos studied the head. It was slightly larger, proportionally, than a real meadowlark's, seamlessly joined against the grain. He pressed his thumb firmly against the side of the bird's head, opposite the direction the feathers were carved. Nothing. He tried, twisting clockwise. It resisted. Then, steeling himself, he twisted counterclockwise against the natural flow of the wood grain. It moved, a tiny, almost imperceptible quarter turn, and then with a soft, precise click, the bird's head popped up slightly, revealing a hidden cavity beneath it. Nestled within, gleaming dully, was not a map fragment, but a slender, cylindrical lens of polished rock crystal. Amos carefully extracted it. It was cool to the touch, perfectly formed. He held it up. Through it, the faint stars above seemed magnified, brighter. A spyglass lens? Lila breathed, confused. Amos looked at the detailed map of Shadow Canyon. In the corner, almost invisible, Elias had drawn a tiny, stylized sun. He held the lens over it. Instantly, the lines of the map seemed to sharpen, and fine, nearly invisible etchings became clear around the X, a series of numbers in a single word, bearing 335 degrees. He grabbed the brass compass. The cracked glass couldn't obscure the needle. He rotated the compass housing until the bearing marker aligned with 335 degrees. The needle now pointed not just north, but along a very specific northwest path, the path to the Sun's Vein. Elias's key had unlocked the final direction. A grim satisfaction warred with the overwhelming peril. They had the bearing. They had the map. They knew the truth, but they were trapped in a dead-end gulch, hunted by a ruthless killer who knew the value of what they now possessed. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the relative quiet of the canyon. Not the fire, not pursuit. A low, rhythmic thumping, growing steadily louder. It echoed strangely off the walls. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming not from the direction of the burning ranch, but from further down the gulch, from the darkness ahead, where the canyon narrowed again. Amos and Lila froze, staring into the impenetrable blackness beyond the seep spring. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied now by the jingle of harness and a low murmur of voices. Torchlight flickered, casting monstrous, Leaping shadows on the canyon walls ahead. A party of riders was approaching, blocking their only escape route deeper into the gulch. Amos shoved the lens, the bird, and the maps back into the satchel, slinging it over his shoulder. He cocked the Henry rifle. The metallic snicked shockingly loud. He pushed Lila behind him, toward the relative cover of a large boulder near the seep. His heart hammered against his ribs. Rourke? Had he circled ahead? Or was this another unforeseen danger in this labyrinth of stone? The torchlight grew brighter, illuminating the lead rider as he rounded a bend 50 yards ahead. It wasn't Silas Rourke. The man was older, lean and weathered as sun-bleached timber, with a thick gray beard and eyes that gleamed like chips of obsidian in the torchlight. He wore a battered cavalry hat and a long, trail-dusted duster. He held up a hand, halting the half-dozen rough-looking men behind him. His gaze swept the seep spring, landing unerringly on Amos and Lila's hiding spot. A slow, humorless smile spread across his face, revealing stained teeth. "Well, now," the man drawled, his voice echoing in the confined space. His eyes fixed on the leather satchel-stamped Ike slung over Amos's shoulder. "Looks like we finally caught up with Elias Kane's legacy. And his little bird." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the damp stones. "Name's Cyrus Holt. And that treasure map you're holding belongs to the Silver Peaks Consolidated Mining Company. Hand it over, along with the girl. Rourke's bounty on her head's just a bonus." Cyrus Holt's words hung in the damp, torchlit air of the gulch like a death sentence. The Silver Peaks Consolidated Mining Company. The name tasted like iron filings and greed. Behind Holt, his men shifted, hands resting near holsters, eyes hard and acquisitive in the flickering light. The satchel over Amos's shoulder felt heavier than stone. It held not just a map to gold, but Elias's final cry for help, Jedediah Vance's murder, and Lila's stolen childhood. Now, it drew corporate wolves and vengeful snakes like carrion. Lila pressed against the cold rock behind Amos, her storm-gray eyes wide with fresh terror, fixed on Holt. The carved bird, retrieved from the satchel, was a cold weight in Amos's fist. The lens, the bearing. They were useless trinkets here, trapped in this dead-end canyon with Holt's men blocking the way forward and Rourke's fire and fury surely closing him behind. Amos met Holt's obsidian gaze. He saw no mercy, only the cold calculation of a man used to crushing smaller claims and lives beneath the company boot. Hand over the map, and Lila? Unthinkable. Surrender meant death for both of them the moment Holt had what he wanted. Fight? Against 6 armed riders in a narrow gulch? Suicide. His mind raced, scanning the torchlit walls, the seep spring, the high, narrow strip of sky. Desperation honed his thoughts to a sharp point. Consolidated, huh? Amos drawled, his voice rough but steady, projecting a calm he didn't feel. He subtly shifted his grip on the Henry rifle, finger near the trigger. "Reckon Elias and Jedediah Vance didn't see their names on your deed." He saw Holt's eyes flicker slightly at Jedediah's name, confirmation the company knew the players. That gold belongs to their heirs. This girl. He tilted his head slightly towards Lila. Holt spat again. Gold belongs to whoever files a claim and holds it with iron. Vance is worm food. Kane's likely the same. Girls just loose ends. Hand it over, Kane. Last offer. His hand drifted toward his own holster revolver. The tension stretched, brittle as thin ice. The only sounds of the drip of water, the snort of a horse, and the distant, dying roar of the ranch fire. Amos needed a moment. A diversion. His gaze snagged on the seep spring, its water trickling down the rock face into the shallow pool. And higher, just visible in the torchlight, a precariously balanced cluster of boulders, lodged where the canyon wall had crumbled long ago. Nature's trap. "Lila," Amos murmured, so low only she could hear. "When I move, get ready to run. Back the way we came. Fast as you can." He squeezed the carved bird in his pocket, a talisman of Elias's desperate hope. Protect the girl. He took a slow step forward, away from the boulder, drawing all eyes. He held the Henry loosely, non-threateningly. "All right, Holt, you win." He raised his voice. "The map's yours." He started to slowly unsling the satchel from his shoulder, the movement deliberate. Holt's men leaned forward slightly, avarice overriding caution. Amos let the satchel strap slip down his arm. Then, in one fluid motion, he didn't drop it. He swung it hard, like a sling, aiming not at Holt, but at the cluster of torches held by the men behind him. The heavy leather bag, weighted with compass and maps, slammed into the nearest torch-bearer's arm. The man yelled, stumbling back. The torch flew from his grasp, spinning through the air. Simultaneously, Amos dropped to one knee, bringing the Henry rifle up. He didn't aim at the man. He aimed high, at the base of the precariously balanced boulders above the seep spring. He fired. Once. Twice. The sharp cracks echoed like thunder in the gulch. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Holt's men recoiled, hands go to guns, confusion reigning. Then, with a grinding groan that shook the very ground, the cluster of boulders shifted. Dirt and smaller rocks rained down. One massive stone teetered, then broke free, crashing down onto the rocks below it. A chain reaction began. A small avalanche of rock and earth roared down the canyon wall, directly toward Holt and his clustered men at the seep spring. "Rockfall!" someone screamed. Chaos erupted. Horses reared in terror, screaming. Men scrambled, trying to dodge the tumbling debris. Holt was thrown from his saddle as his horse bolted. Dust billowed, thick and choking, filling the gulch, mingling with the torch smoke. "Now, Lila, run!" Amos roared, grabbing her arm. They turned and sprinted back the way they had come, toward the burning ranch and the unseen menace of Rourke, plunging into the swirling dust cloud. The sound behind them were horrific. The roar of falling rock, the screams of men and horses, Holt's furious bellowing. Amos didn't look back. Survival was a narrow path forward. They burst out of the choking dust near the gulch entrance. The scene before them was apocalyptic. The ranch was a smoldering ruin, glowing embers painting the hollow in shades of hell. The acrid stench of burnt wood and sage was overwhelming. But the main fire had passed, leaving a scorched wasteland under a sky beginning to pale with the first hint of false dawn in the east. They had a moment, only a moment. Amos pulled Lila toward the relative cover of a cluster of scorched pinyon pines, their blackened skeletons offering meager shelter. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. Lila leaned against a charred trunk, trembling violently, her eyes scanning the desolation that had been her brief sanctuary. The map, the bearing. She panted, her hand going to her throat where the bird had hung. Shadow Canyon. Amos nodded grimly, pulling the brass compass from the satchel. He checked the bearing. 335 degrees. Northwest. He looked toward the Wind River peaks, purple and snow-capped against the paling sky. Somewhere in those forbidding heights lay Shadow Canyon, the sun's vein, Elias's dream and his doom. We need to move. Holt's men are tangled, not finished. And Rourke, as if summoned by the name, a shot cracked from the ridge above the smoldering ranch house. A bullet kicked up ash in dirty yard from Amos's boot. They ducked deeper into the pinyon skeletons. "Kane!" Rourke's voice, raw with fury and smoke, echoed across the hollow. He stood silhouetted on the ridge, a dark, vengeful shape against the gray pre-dawn light. "You think rockslide save you? You think fire cleans your debt? You owe me, Kane. You and that thieving brat owe me blood and gold." He fired again wildly, the bullet whining overhead. He was alone, his men likely scattered or dead. But a single, determined snake was deadly enough. Amos saw the madness in Rourke's posture, the reckless rage. He wouldn't stop, not ever. The satchel, the map, Lila, they were just fuel for his obsessive fire. He looked at Lila, her face pale but set with a fierce determination that mirrored Jedediah Vance's storm-gray eyes. Elias's last plea echoed, "Protect the girl." He couldn't lead Rourke to Shadow Canyon. That path was closed. There was only one way to end this. "Lila," he said, his voice low and urgent. He pressed the brass compass and the folded map into her hands. Then he pulled Elias's letter from the satchel and tucked it inside her coat. "Take these." The bearing set. "Head northwest. Find Shadow Canyon." He pointed toward the break in the scorched hills, a faint trail leading towards the distant mountains. "Go. Now. Stay low. Keep the sun on your left come morning." Her eyes widened in panic. "No, I won't leave you. He'll kill you. He'll kill us both if we stay together," Amos stated flatly. "He wants me now. Thinks I have it all. I'll draw him off. Give you time." He placed the carved wooden meadowlark back into her palm, closing her fingers around it. "This is your legacy. Elias's. Your pa's. Not Rourke's. Not Holt's. Yours. Find it. Live free." He saw Sarah's kindness in her fear, Beth's stubborn spirit in her refusal to flee. This girl was family, a miracle found in leftovers and storm-gray eyes. "Go. Please." Tears welled, but she blinked them back. She clutched the compass, the map, the bird. She understood the terrible calculus of survival. She threw her arms around him in a fierce, desperate hug. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick with grief and gratitude. Then she turned, melting into shadows of scorched pines like a ghost, heading northwest, bent low, disappearing into the ashy gloom. Amos watched her vanish. A strange peace settled over him, cold and clear. He'd done it, protected Elias's kin, given her a chance. Sarah and Beth would understand. He picked up the Henry rifle, checking the chamber. 3 rounds left. He slung the now-empty satchel over his shoulder, bait for the snake. He stepped out from the pinyon cover into the open, ash-strewn ground before the ruins of his cabin. He raised the rifle and fired a shot towards Rourke on the ridge. Not to hit, to enrage, to draw. "Rourke," he bellowed, his voice carrying in the dawn stillness. "Looking for your gold? It's right here." He shook the empty satchel. "Come and get it, you murdering snake." A roar of pure rage answered him. Rourke scrambled down the ridge, sliding in the loose ash, his movements fueled by venomous fury. He hit the flat ground and broke into a run, draw his revolver, firing wildly as he came. Bullets kicked up dirt and ash around Amos. Amos didn't flinch. He stood his ground near the blackened skeleton of the corral. The Henry rifle held steady. He waited. Let Rourke close the distance. Let the madness consume him. The world narrowed to the sights of the rifle, the charging figure, the smoldering ruins of everything he'd lost and everything he'd found. At 50 yards, Amos took a breath, the air tasting of ash and endings. He exhaled slowly, finger tightening on the trigger. He fired. Rourke jerked, stumbled, but kept coming, a growl ripping from his throat. Amos worked the lever, chambering another round. Fired again. This time, Rourke went down hard, clutching his leg, his revolver skittering away. He writhed in the ash, cursing, trying to drag himself forward. Amos walked towards him, the rifle pointed down. He stopped 10 feet away. Rourke glared up, his face contorted with pain and hatred, streaked with soot and blood. You ruined everything, Kane. That gold was mine." "It was blood money, Rourke," Amos said, his voice quiet, colder than the dawn wind. "Elias's blood, Jedediah Vance's blood. You don't get to steal lives and call it yours." He saw the empty, ravenous void in Rourke's eyes. There was no redemption here, only a beast cornered. Rourke snarled, his hand darting toward the boot knife. Amos didn't hesitate. The Henry rifle spoke its final word. The crack echoed across the hollow, bouncing off the scorched hills. Rourke slumped back into the ash, his eyes staring sightless at the paling sky. Silence descended, deeper than before. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the ruins and the distant cry of a hawk. Amos lowered the rifle. It was done. The ledger settled in ash and blood, as the frontier demanded. He felt no triumph, only a profound weariness and a hollow ache where grief and rage had burned. He looked northwest, toward the path Lila had taken. The first true rays of dawn were breaking over the wind rivers, painting the snow-capped peaks in rose and gold. Shadow Canyon lay somewhere in that vastness. Elias's dream, Lila's hope. He wouldn't follow her. That path was hers alone. His place was here, amidst the ashes. But the emptiness felt different now. Not just the absence of Sarah and Beth, but the space where Lila's fierce spirit had briefly flared. He spent the day tending to grim necessities, burying Rourke in a shallow, unmarked grave in the scorched earth, salvaging what little he could from the ruins. His Colt, miraculously unscathed near the cabin's stone hearth, a dented tin coffee pot. The daguerreotype of Sarah and Beth, the glass cracked but their smiles intact. He turned it face up on a flat stone near the seeped spring that still trickled pure and cold. A memorial. Weeks passed. The charred scars on the land began to soften under spring rains. Amos rebuilt, slowly, not the grand ranch, but a smaller, sturdier cabin near the seeped spring. He repaired the corral, bought a raw-boned mare from a passing trader. The work was hard, the solitude profound, but the crushing weight of grief had shifted. It was still there, a familiar stone, but it no longer threatened to drown him. He thought of Elias, his brother lost to gold fever, whose final act had been to protect a friend's child. He thought of Jedediah Vance, who trusted his daughter with a carved bird and a desperate hope. He thought of Lila Vance, storm-gray eyes full of resilience that defied the harshness of the world. One crisp morning, as frost glittered like scattered diamonds on the new grass, pushing through the ash, a rider approached. Not Holt. Amos had heard whispers the mining boss had broken his leg in a rockfall and slunk back to Cheyenne. This rider was Jed Cooper, the Iron Hollow mercantile owner. He reined in, looking at the rebuilt cabin, the mare in the corral. Kane. Jed nodded, his expression unreadable. He dismounted, pulling a small, cloth-wrapped package from his saddlebag. Stage came through yesterday. This was for you. From up north, Silver Peak Way. Amos took the package, his pulse quickening slightly. It was light. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a small, smooth stone, speckled green and gray, and a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. He recognized the handwriting instantly. Lila's, firmer now than when she'd written her name in his cabin. Amos. Made it. Shadow Canyon is real. More beautiful than Pa or Uncle Elias ever said. Found the sun's vein, not just gold. A whole valley hidden, green and good. Water pure as tears. Building a cabin near the spring Elias marked. Safe. Use the bird. Every day. Remembering. Thank you for the leftovers. Thank you for the chance. The stones from the creek here. So you know the place is real. So you know I'm home. Maybe someday if the trail's clear, your friend, Lila. There was no grand declaration, no promise. Just a shared truth. A stone from a hidden valley. A home found. Amos turned the smooth stone over in his palm. It felt warm, alive with the promise of a distant spring. He looked up at the vast Wyoming sky, stretching endless and blue over his rebuilt life, over the ashes of the past. The wind sighed through the new pinyon shoots, a gentle sound. In the distance, clear and impossibly sweet, a meadowlark sang its morning hymn from a patch of unburnt sage. The sound echoed the carving Elias had made, the hope Jedediah had entrusted, the miracle Amos had found in a desperate girl's storm-gray eyes. He wasn't alone. The world was harsh, scarred, but beneath the ashes, life, stubborn and singing, endured. He tucked the stone and the letter carefully into his pocket, next to the cracked daguerreotype, and turned back to his work. The sun was warm on his back. The day was just beginning.